Hello, my name is Brenna Barnhart, and I'm a member of the NCAA Enforcement staff. Along with my colleague Russell Register, we'll be talking to you today about how to conduct an on-campus investigation. This presentation is part one of a two-part series. The second portion will be a live session presented by our colleagues, Tom Hosty and Laura Wirtz, on June 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern. So make sure to tune in then for even more information on the best practices when conducting an on-campus investigation. During this presentation, we'll cover the basics of conducting an on-campus investigation, including developing an institutional investigative policy and case strategy. We'll also cover the resources available to you on ncaa.org. So let's start with what the enforcement staff believes is the foundation to an effective on-campus investigation, the institutional investigative policy. It's important to note here that most of what we'll discuss in this presentation applies to investigations into Level 1 and Level 2 violations. While there are takeaways that can be applied to Level 3 violations, we're really going to focus on the investigation of significant violations. An institutional investigative policy is your game plan when potential NCAA violations arise on campus. Having one available for your institutional staff, whether in your handbook or online, promotes consistency and transparency. People know what to expect before an investigation even begins. Along these same lines, a policy allows for a timely and organized response. When an issue comes up on campus, you won't need to spend time figuring out who should be involved, who's ultimately responsible for various tasks, what first steps to take. This will all be outlined in the policy so you can hit the ground running. An investigative policy also helps maintain the integrity of the investigation. As we'll discuss later, an effective investigation always strives to obtain the most untainted and complete information. A policy that clearly outlines expectations of both those on the investigative team as well as those interviewed will help maintain that integrity. And finally, having an investigative policy and following it when an issue comes up may avoid questions from the enforcement staff and the Committee on Infractions about monitoring expectations. Now, let me be clear. If you don't have a policy, it's not an automatic violation, just like having a policy isn't a safe harbor. But if your institution doesn't have a policy or has one but doesn't follow it, there will certainly be questions about whether the institution failed to monitor or violated institutional control legislation. So what should be in an institutional investigative policy? First, there should be criteria regarding what triggers an investigation. Every potential violation may not require a full-fledged investigation with interviews and document requests. However, having an investigative policy that outlines what steps should be taken in different circumstances helps make the process clear for all involved. Along these same lines, the policy should clearly define roles and responsibilities. This allows the investigative team to quickly assemble and get to work when the time comes. We encourage you to think outside of the compliance staff and even athletics department when putting together your investigative team. Many investigative teams include the institution's general counsel and faculty athletics representative. You may also want to consider including someone with subject matter expertise in certain areas, like financial aid or academics, depending on the nature of the potential violations. However, it's still important to keep your investigative circle small in order to protect the integrity of the investigation. It is also helpful if your investigative policy includes the resources available to the investigative team, including any interview notice forms, confidentiality instructions, and processes for obtaining documentation. We encourage you to work with your institution's general counsel's office to determine what resources may be available to you based on your institutional policies, as well as state and federal regulations. Finally, the investigative policy should outline the process for reporting any discovered violations and who has the responsibility for maintaining the investigative file, which should be done whether any violations are substantiated or not. It's important to note that these are just key areas of an investigative policy. We encourage you to develop a policy and investigative framework that is specific and unique to your institution. So, what are the key takeaways? If your institution does not have an investigative policy, we strongly encourage you to develop one. It's better to have a game plan in case something happens than try to put one together on the fly. If your institution does have an investigative policy, make sure it's up to date and that it's followed. Now, I'll turn it over to Russell to walk you through launching an on-campus investigation. Russell?
Thanks, Brenna. In this section, we will cover what steps and requests you should consider when launching an investigation on your campus. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list of steps to take, but rather areas that you should consider in your institutional investigation that can be modified based upon the situation that you may be investigating. When presented with information, you should first evaluate it for possible violations of NCAA legislation. It's important to flag possible violations that affect a student-athlete's eligibility, as these can be time-sensitive and might necessitate a student-athlete reinstatement case be opened. Most all investigations include a series of interviews to help develop the full facts of the case. You should develop a list of potential interviewees, including all individuals who may have pertinent first-hand knowledge of the activities under investigation. Further, you should consider the best order of the interviews. Protecting the integrity of the investigation is key to obtaining full and untainted information, so interview order is critical to limiting interviewees from talking with one another or witness tampering. Strategies for interview order and protecting the integrity of the investigation will be covered in more detail during Part 2 of this presentation. It is also important to identify if there is relevant documentation that you should request or gather from sources you have access to. Let's talk about this in more detail. When requesting documents, it's important to consider that in some instances, requesting documents directly from individuals could tip them off that there is an issue under investigation. It may be best to start with documents you already have access to, such as compliance, university phone, email, and academic records. In some cases, you will need to request records from third parties outside of your institution. In these cases, the best practice is to send a written request with a specific response date, a release date, if necessary, and the specific format you would like to receive the documents in. This is true especially if the information is electronic. This slide includes examples of computer, financial, academic, vehicle, phone, travel, social media, and recruiting files that could be helpful in your campus investigation. While you would not need to request all of these records in every case, keep in mind that some records that aren't directly related to a potential violation, perhaps telephone records, may have helpful contextual information for your investigation. It's important to remember that prior to requesting these records, you should always check with your institution's general counsel on applicable institutional policies, as well as local and state laws, and any implications they may have on your requests. As mentioned earlier, interviews are an integral part of any investigation and case strategy. In determining who to interview, as well as the sequence, it's important to consider who is required to cooperate in an interview under NCAA Bylaw 10.1. These include institutional staff members, current and former athletics department staff members, current student athletes, and prospective student athletes. If these individuals refuse to cooperate in an investigation, they could face additional allegations of NCAA violations. In regard to employment, however, it is important to consult with your institution's legal counsel. Again, in Part 2 of this presentation, you'll learn more strategies about interview sequencing and strategy. It should be noted that parents and legal guardians, third parties, high school and non-scholastic coaches, former student athletes, and representatives of the institution's athletics interests are not expressly required to cooperate in an investigation under NCAA bylaws. However, Because these individuals often have key facts about potential violations, the enforcement staff still regularly requests and obtains cooperation in interviews. While it's important to keep your investigative team small, you should also be thoughtful when deciding who will ask these third parties to interview. For example, your athletics director may have a close relationship with a booster and could explain how cooperating would help the institution. Similarly, a compliance officer may have maintained a good relationship with a former student athlete or coach and would be in the best position to obtain their cooperation. Now back to Brenna, who will cover next steps.
Thanks, Russell. Once you've decided what documents to request, who to interview, and the order, now comes the time to conduct the actual interviews. Some of the key logistical considerations include the location and method of the interview, as well as who will be present. For location and method, the enforcement staff prefers to conduct key interviews in person and to record those interviews. The recording ensures there is no confusion on exactly what was asked and what was answered. However, if we're unable to record the interview, we write a formal interview summary that we then ask the interviewee to sign to verify its accuracy. In regard to who is present at the interview, it's important to consider what would make the interviewee feel most comfortable. For example, an interviewee may not want his or her direct supervisor present when reporting information about potential violations. Further, the more people present during an interview, the harder it becomes to protect the integrity of the investigation. For example, if you need to interview both a parent and a student athlete about a potential violation, consider interviewing the parent first and the student athlete second, so if the parent wants to sit in on their child's interview, they can do so without fears of tainting the information. In addition to the room logistics, it's also important to provide the interviewee with notices about their rights and responsibilities under NCAA bylaws. This includes the ability to have legal counsel present, as well as the obligation to provide truthful and complete information. If you're looking for an example, the enforcement staff is happy to provide you with a copy of our interview notice form. However, we also encourage you to work with your institution's general counsel to make it specific to your institution. Once a recorded interview starts, you should note the date, time, and location. You should also confirm on the record that you received the interviewee's permission to record. After introductions, it's important to again cover those interview notices, including the purpose of the interview, the ramifications for not being truthful and forthcoming, and the ability to have legal counsel present. During part 2 of this presentation, our colleagues will cover in more detail some specific interviewing techniques and strategies you can use throughout the interview. However, moving to the conclusion, you should always request the interviewee keep what was discussed confidential in order to protect the integrity of the investigation. This is especially important for those individuals subject to Bylaw 19, as a separate violation could result for not adhering to those confidentiality requirements. One question we're often asked is, when should institutions notify the enforcement staff of an on-campus investigation? While institutions don't need to tell us every time they learn of potential violations, we do strongly encourage you to reach out if you learn of potential Level 1 or Level 2 violations. Depending on the type of violation, the enforcement staff may join in with the institution in a collaborative investigation. However, we could also tell the institution to go ahead and investigate on its own and provide a self-report. Either way, the enforcement staff is always available to serve as a resource to institutions as they conduct investigations. Whether an investigation is led by the institution or enforcement staff, they all have 3 potential outcomes. First, the investigation may find no violation, either because the initial information was inaccurate or the parties were unable to substantiate whether a violation occurred. If that's the case, we encourage the institution to maintain its investigative file in case the same information is reported to the enforcement staff or down the road, additional information comes to light. Second, the investigation may uncover a Level 3 violation, which should be reported through the institution's normal processes via RSRO. Finally, the investigation may result in Level 1 or Level 2 violations. If that's the case, the institution should submit a self-report that includes a summary of the institution's investigation, findings, self-imposed penalties, and corrective measures. It should also identify any student-athlete reinstatement issues and include all relevant documentation, including any interview recordings. For a detailed explanation on what to include in a self-report, you can review the NCAA Member Resource Guide located on ncaa.org. Now back to Russell.
Before we conclude and direct you to available online resources, we wanted to take a moment to give a brief overview of the Enforcement Department structure. The enforcement staff includes our development and operations teams, investigations and processing teams, Level 3 secondary staff, and our quality control group. Our development and operations staff include individuals who develop relationships and outreach related to trends and issues in basketball and football. Staff in this area also work in the Events and Certification Approvals Group, or ECAG. Most recently, the staff now encompasses individuals who work in the space of agent certification and approvals. Our investigations and processing group includes staff who are charged with working with the NCAA membership to investigate potential major or Level 1, Level 2 violations across all divisions and all sports. If violations are substantiated, these staff also process these violations through one of the resolution paths through the Committee on Infractions. The Enforcement Level 3 secondary staff may be a staff that you will come into contact with the most. This staff reviews and processes all secondary Level 3 cases that are submitted by the NCAA membership across all sports and divisions. The last part of our staff is made up by the individuals in our quality control group. This group is primarily internally facing, as it monitors our work to ensure that we are operating in a uniform and accurate manner. This group reviews, improves and updates our processes, documents, case management systems, and many other data tracking systems within the department. On this slide, you can see many available resources for the NCAA membership. To access these resources, as well as many others, simply navigate to ncaa.org, go to your Divisions tab at the top of the page, and hover over it to show the different resources for that division. Click on the Enforcement link to find these helpful resources. Thank you for participating in this learning module. We hope that you have found it informative. For Part 2 of the Enforcement section of Welcome to the World of Rules Compliance, we hope that you will participate in the upcoming live webinar that will cover these topics and where you can submit and have your questions answered by members of the enforcement staff. Thanks again for your participation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the enforcement staff. Have a good day.